booklet, and there's slides and video up there. Because the booklet covers kind of reflections on the content of what was produced, I'm here going to focus on the process and how the practices of activism and creative research mesh together and bring things up to date, adding something about the exhibition. So my research looks at practices of welcome with and for refugees and asylum in rural areas of Wales. And after this morning's talks, I felt sort of tempted to completely change the emphasis of my talk, as I'm aware of the sort of problematic issues around the ideas of hospitality and welcome. My own motivation for looking at this subject was my own migration from London to rural Wales and coming across this kind of activism and getting involved myself, but also being a bit unsettled that we might in some ways be emphasising the us and them, complicit in migrantisation and emphasising refuginess. But there's also the question of, as activists, what do we do and how? And also interested in how it relates to activism, more sort of campaigning activism, looking at, you know, changing things in other ways. But I haven't changed the emphasis, I'm sticking with my original plan. So it explores interactions which centre on activities as outlined in the slide, people with very different experiences and histories of migration and of language, and very different senses of familiarity with being in rural Wales, encounter each other through these practices. And I'm interested in how they make meaning and mobilise narratives around migrations and in what ways they might sustain or disrupt prevailing narratives around migration and refugees. And rural activism of this kind has, I think, sometimes been overlooked in favour of a focus on the city. I'm interested in language, understood by Pennycook, Simpson and others, as a social participation rather than a system or a fixed entity. I'm interested in how communicative repertoires of spoken and unspoken language are assembled in improvised and creative ways, and perhaps shift away from the dominance of competence in English language being used as a measure or signifier of belonging and citizenship. Creative methods are central to my project. Harriet Hawkins details how creative geographies can cover a range of things, from collaborations in the arts to more vernacular craft, and also amateur practices, which is definitely the category my work fits into. She also writes about how creativity is sometimes uncritically seen as inherently good. So including anything and everything as creative can lead to it becoming meaningless. And I think there can be a tendency to think that just because something's creative, it overcomes inequalities and differences. So lots to think about there. My interest is in how creative methods can generate alternative literacies, open up access to meaning making to those who speak English as an additional language, and also how they can combine with activist aims. As my research developed, any division between the blends of social and creative practices characteristic of the activities being researched and the creative practices of my research itself became increasingly indistinct. The original research plan was to work with different sanctuary and refugee support groups across rural Wales, but during the pandemic it was difficult to make fresh contacts. So I focused on two groups that I've been personally involved with for a long time. One is Abergavenny Town of Sanctuary, my local town, which mainly connects with refugees who've been resettled there, who are resident there through the resettlement project. But this presentation is about this group Migrants Organise, a London-based organisation with a busy community programme. Over 3 years pre-pandemic, individuals and small groups of members, volunteers and staff travelled from London for short breaks, staying in domestic home environments in the village of Llanbathley, where I live, some coming back repeatedly. As we couldn't meet or plan more visits, I exchanged homemade postcards with about 10 of these former visitors as a way of creating a research space and reconnecting during this time. The entanglements of my relations with participants as researcher, activist, host and friend have been both enriching and discomforting. Blurred boundaries are crossed and uncrossed all the time. Sometimes it's easy to drift across, it's unnoticeable, sometimes it's uncomfortable. These specific relations are further caught up with my position more broadly, being a white, middle-class, older woman, amongst a mixed group of participants where many are socially and materially positioned much more precariously than myself. And this applies to my involvement in the groups generally as well, not just as a researcher. I found Chadwick and Hemming's work helpful in thinking about my approach. There's not really enough time to do these justice here, but just to mention briefly, and I've kind of rather thrown up some quotes. They propose that affective dissonance, the feelings of discomfort that arise out of research across difference and inequality, can be brought into play as a lively actant in opening up different ways of knowing. They argue that these intensities of feeling can serve to develop a feminist praxis that doesn't erase difference, but foregrounds a search for solidarity not based on identity, but on modes of engagement, processes of knowledge production, enacting epistemic uncertainty and sharing a desire for transformation. They also have a really interesting critique of empathy and reciprocity, which there isn't really time for here, but I might come back to it, as these notions are something of a presence within the groups under consideration in the research. Thinking about space, as Massey does, as the intersection of mobile trajectories and constellations of stories so far, caught up in wider power geometries. Here's a short time-lapse video sequence made by one of the contributors during her stay with us in Llanfapley. At the time, she's made it on her phone. At the time, it brought to mind the settling and unsettling, gathering and leave-taking that marked the encounters with her and other visitors. Trajectories meeting fleetingly within the larger network of interconnected branches. The tree animated with birds seems to link with the idea of the house as the physical and social space these temporary gatherings pass through. Somehow we all got here through socially differentiated and uneven and unequal experiences of mobility. The static card is a card I made for her because I was thinking how we all arrived in different ways to the new social space of the postcard making too, where we look back at our temporary convergence in the house. This study concerns people, including myself as researcher, who might be considered as participating in intersecting life worlds that are variously familiar and unfamiliar. A key aspect of organised activities of welcome is that people who would be pretty unlikely to meet in the regular course of their daily lives have the opportunity to meet and engage with each other. So I see these gatherings of people as encounters, but I'm still working out what this might mean outside the everyday use of the word. Sarah Ahmed's Strange Encounters offers one way in. I'd be happy to hear from others about their ideas around encounters. That's why the slide's a bit blank. So here are a couple of quotes, key quotes about language as participation. As mentioned earlier, this is a key theme of my research, and what follows hopefully kind of demonstrates some of this. Postcards were chosen as small, easily accessible mobile objects, carrying meaning through a combination of image and a short chunk of text, enabling people with a wide range of language and literacy skills in English to participate. And I was struck by Pennycook using the example of writing a postcard to elaborate on the idea of language as a social practice, as a set of bundled activities with multifaceted relations to place. So there's the obvious moment of writing the card, but lots of other things going on. Other communicative modes grew around the postcards, enriching the repertoire of resources available for a shared language of participation. So there was a sort of WhatsApp group that kept things going. Boundaries between, and we had a Zoom session, boundaries between spoken, written and visual language, working with technology and with paper, being in physical and digital space, were broken down as people seemed to combine and switch frequently and easily between them. But there was something particularly affecting for me about the material aspect of the postcards, the textures, the mark making, the enclosing and revealing. In particular, temporal and spatial dynamics were introduced as these objects moved between us. There's more about that in the booklet, so I'm not going to say any more about that here. This quote from Angeles and Pratt talks about promoting experimentation with critical creative practice. And the authors of the second quote have written about making a cookbook with migrant communities starting in the intimate space of a kitchen and moving outwards to engage people in marketplaces, etc. And I guess these quotes give an idea of kind of what I'd like to aim for. Still on that one. Through the text of the cards and the Zoom session, the possibility of another visit to Wales came up post-COVID, and also had the chance to put on a small exhibition around the cards. Things merged as we were finally able to organise another visit from migrants organised members to coincide with the exhibition event. This seemed a welcome instance of academic research and activism mutually sustaining and invigorating each other. The research project was instrumental in our reconnection, and what came out of this reconnection enriched the research project. The exhibition event was only a couple of weeks ago, so my thoughts about it are quite fresh and unprocessed, but here it is. The importance of having it in the village was to come, in the village where the participants came originally, was to come full circle so that participants could come and be part of setting up a display and seeing their contributions in the place where everything had started. Also, to create a new encounter between the cards, their creators, and people resident in the village and beyond, to allow for the stories to be activated in new ways and perhaps new stories to emerge. I was keen for it to be on the village scale in order to explore the relation of the rural, local to the global, and to give room to that in a more sort of open presence in the village. I was keen for the cards to be displayed as they might be in a domestic space, hence the shelves and household objects that accompany them. In the end, only 3 of the migrants' organised members were able to return on the dates of the exhibition, but they were key in setting up the display, arranging where they wanted the cards to be, being part of the event. One of them led a dance session. They made more cards. They were there circulating with everybody else. But there are still... something else I missed out. Oh, yeah, and there's a film clip that one of them made about this preparation on the slides that I've got rolling upstairs, which says more about it probably than I am with these slides. He made a little film about it. But there's still something about the host-visitor relation that can't be resolved easily. Hang on. I've missed something. Sorry. Oh, yeah. Various other objects mentioned in the cards were brought in and displayed, or eaten, in the case of Welsh cakes. The mandala flower arrangement was suggested and made by one of the contributors as a sign of welcome at the door of the hall, and that's what people were kind of invited to do while we were there. So I didn't know what to expect, whether 5 people or 50 people would come. I'd gone around all the houses in the village putting an invitation in. What I hadn't really expected was for it to emerge as a kind of community social event, a fitting scale, as the material on display is all about experiences on quite an intimate domestic scale. And I take the word community here to be this sort of transient gathering of people. About 50 people came over the one afternoon, and one morning it was open, enough for a kind of bit of a buzz, but on a scale where people could stay around and connect. Some of the unexpectedness was planned into the event, if that's not a contradiction, as it might not have been what people expected to find in a rural village hall. And some of the pictures illustrate that with the sort of juxtaposition of the surrounding of the village hall with what's in it. People's reasons for coming, their prior knowledge, how much attention they paid to the material, their responses, etc. were varied. On the Sunday, it was apparently announced in church, so some people came after church. Someone messaged saying, sorry, they couldn't make it. They were busy with making the silage, which is a seasonal farming task. And this kind of made me smile, as it would be so unexpected in many other contexts. The reason not for coming, because we were doing the silage. Although the focus was on the display of postcards, the conversations and connections that circulated around the space they created were, of course, very varied, and not necessarily about the cards, in the same way that the cards aren't all well, they're not all by refugees and asylum, they're a real mix, but they're not all about migration, and the conversations that were had were not all about the cards. There were many more conversations and observations that more than these popped in here. These are just what I kind of overheard or took part in. In retrospect, I wish I could have paid more attention to this, but I was too busy, making sure everything was okay and everyone was okay. But I just, with reference to the UCC Ukraine, came up as a conversation, and also how long people had lived in the village, not to do with sort of transnational migration, but how long people had lived in the houses. Where I live, where I've lived for 5 years, my name's Sarah, but if I say to people, they say, oh yes, you live in Jason and Leslie's house, although we've been there 5 years. Anyway, I digress. New cards were made. Some were a direct response to display cards, some just about being there or other things, and so the stories and the conversations continue beyond the original source, and they've now become part of the display. There's more, but I won't let it run all the time. The dancing sessions really brought people together without having to use spoken language. They kind of held people, and people stayed longer. Lots of talk about it afterwards, and there's more film of that upstairs. And so the event has had a kind of afterlife in the village. It's been talked about in the walking group, in the market garden. People took booklets away. I'm going to write about it in the parish magazine. The booklet's been used in a community project in Newport. And the guy who did the dancing, he's put his own commentary on Instagram and stuff. So in small ways, it is travelling and has its own life. However, I'm keen to avoid romanticising this rural event. It wasn't without its discomforts in relation to setting it up, trying to get things right with participants, how people responded. The rural is often not a welcoming place for minoritised and racialised groups. I'm always anxious that people staying with us will experience racism while they are with us, and I wonder if it's the fact they're staying with and accompanied by people seen as local in their whiteness that makes this less likely. But perhaps the event in the village hall can be seen as a political space where new and perhaps unexpected formations have come together through spoken and unspoken language in relation to migration, rurality, belonging, that might resist dominant narratives, even if it be on a tiny scale with very sort of subtle ripple effect. So that was the event in Llanfapley. The cards take, they're here, and I was struck when I set the exhibition up on Monday how kind of, in a way, out of place it looks in the institution of the university. Anyway, it's here, it will take on a new meaning here, and then it's going to go to Migrants Organised headquarters in London where they can have it will stay with them. Last one. As you can probably see from the slides, I am drawn to using fragments, mosaics, collage, intersected with layers of language, or layered with language. For me, they're a way of processing and thinking about what happens in these encounters and in the practices of research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lots of issues I think were raised there, so I'm sure there's one or two questions for Sarah. Diver, totally switch it all, fix it all together, sew it all together.
Yeah, that's the next job.
I love your unexpected, the planned unexpectedness.
Yes.
I think it's kind of a reflection of the incidental, transient moments of it. Can I tell me more about how to plan for the next year? I think we'd all like to know, especially in this kind of context of political futures, which you might told us.
Well, I suppose I don't know, it was only planned in the sense of the context being rural, and what was happening might be unexpected to people. I suppose that's what I meant by it. Being kind of planned in. I suppose, part of what I want to do is to sort of bring these things into more unexpected places where they,
It's about places, it's about times, it's about relations. What is it? What was exactly planned?
Well, it was planned to have it specifically in the village, but what happened there, as I said, that the sort of it became a kind of event where all those, where it was, who was there, what happened, all kind of, went together to make something which I can't name because I don't know. But it was all those things, yeah.
May I ask what about after? There was a question there. What do you do with these postcards? I saw there the exhibit and to make the booklet, which is great. But are you planning to do something more?
Well, they will go to the Migrants Organise headquarters in London, and I'm hoping that they will have some idea about what they want to do, and I may or may not be involved in that. If they decide to have an event there, I will go and maybe part of it, but I would probably hope, it would be nice if they took the lead on that, and or we collaborate on it in a different way.
About these communities of practice, it would be nice, I don't know if it's possible in your plan, but to connect different communities through the postcard, right? It could be like reception centers, villages, or other places where people, they communicate through the postcard, and then you can even enlarge and create more ties.
Yes, it would be nice for it to, the residents of the village who came to the exhibition, they also made postcards, so that's sort of been added, but it would be nice to take it. The other thing that kind of didn't work was that I thought the participants might exchange postcards to each other, but it all kind of went through me, which, at the time, and because of their situation, it was more difficult to sort of do it that way, but that would also have been, or I was thinking even, they might want to send a postcard to somebody else that, nothing to do with me, but send a message to somebody, a friend or somebody in authority or whatever, but that didn't happen. But maybe, there's sort of more possibilities for it to put its feelers out.
I'm going to ask you a question because I'm going to be cheeky, the chair. But as I've written about how Brexit and then COVID have sort of foregrounded the rural bit very, very strongly, but also, particularly COVID has also foregrounded questions like who belongs, who doesn't belong in those rural places. So inevitably, that must have impacted on your research, and I think you definitely be asked about this in a PhD bio, for example, COVID, how that sort of, how the people that you're engaging with, how they sort of felt, how they've been impacted on the whole sort of situation.
Yeah, some of the postcards do mention, there's one, and it mentions it in the booklet, that he describes what it's like to be in London during COVID, and the atmosphere and everything, and his memories of coming to, more rural setting. So it is mentioned actually in the postcards, and obviously it affected, the way research happened and the timing. The exhibition has happened a year after the postcards were made, so it's all been, and that was, I didn't even know whether people would be interested, whether the moment had passed for the participants and they wouldn't really want to go back to the postcards and having an exhibition because of COVID and this big gap in time. But and also, their lives have all changed in that year in different ways.
I was also thinking how the residents of these, permanent residents of these locations, how they may have changed attitude towards migrants and
I think I haven't really got that in the I thought I might sort of pick up more about that through having this event, and I have to say that I picked up some things. Like there was a couple of people who came who didn't really know what it was, and when they saw it, there's one people in the village in particular I'm thinking of who obviously thought, oh no, this isn't what I want, and they sort of left really quickly. And then other people who, again, didn't really know what to expect, but were very engaged. So it was a variety. There were definitely some people who thought, oh no, this isn't for me, and went off again.
So, all of this is really quite fascinating. I just have this one question about your own position in it, because it is all about the rural and the migrants, but then you and
Yes.
rural, and the fact that you still live in, was it Jane and Leslie's house?
Yes.
But, you know, it's sort of
Yeah.
highlights that you might not be. Well, I wonder how the village saw you doing this. Is it like
Yeah, and that was something I did think about, whether then, you know, the way I would be sort of seen in the village as not only somebody who'd moved from London, but also this person who, you know, might be putting unexpected things in the village that they might not be so receptive to, especially when the Jubilee, you know, the next thing is the Jubilee, which I'm not going to be involved in, but I think that's seen also as, well, why, you know, we're getting involved in your thing, why aren't you getting involved in our thing? So there's something about being that kind of migrant feeling, and the discussion that the couple who discussed, we got into a conversation about how long people had lived in different houses. I think their interpretation of what was there for them kind of just switched into something about you know, how long everybody had been in the village, and that was sort of where they went with it. Nothing, you know, not to do with transnational migration, but with, you know, with small movements between houses.
It's time for one more question.
Can I ask a question again? But I'll just ask a quick story.
Two in one sentence.
What's the relationship people have with postcards? Because, you know, can these postcards be used in other countries as a kind of method? Because I feel, you know, we talked about Musaro.
Yes.
This is a very British thing. Postcards and sending postcards. And as a foreigner, I feel like, okay, why would you send a postcard?
It's also an age thing that, you know, that younger people probably less likely to send.
Things in our country can use it as a method in Spain, Italy.
Yeah, but many say that.
I don't know.
I don't think it's very British. I mean, I don't know if it's also in other countries, but in Italy, still now I hear people who send postcards. And you remind me like a project that some creative people did a few years ago when Salvini was Minister of Interior. He was against migration or whatever. So they did a call and say, everyone who wants to send a postcard to Salvini, we collect all the postcards. And, you know, and then they collected 10,000 postcards. It was like, the title was "È finita la pacchia." That was like, for Salvini was like, now, you know, you refugees, you finished to enjoy, to being refugees, like fake refugees. And then this exhibit, these massive 10,000 postcards were brought to the Ministry of Interior, and then there was an exhibit in many places. So it's interesting how you can use also this kind of creative methodologies in order to be activist or to...
Yeah, we did actually in Abergavenny, not with postcards, but with, it was a sort of national thing of an orange heart, which was a sort of, became used by quite a lot of national sort of refugee support groups. And we, in our town, got people to write messages, and then we posted them all in a package to our local MP, who's really, and well, Eleanor knows, he's a sort of lost cause, but we keep going. We sent him a big package of these, as I say, they weren't cards, but there was a physical sort of thing. Unfortunately, it wasn't made into an exhibition. He never responded, but
okay, we'll move on.
We tried. Thank you. Sorry.
Right, that's a good start. So our next speaker is just coming down now. Pierluigi Musarò. All the way from Italy, I believe.
Yes. Can you recognize my accent?
Well, and I do believe we're going to be talking about creative methodologies, which is very much, I think, goes well with free frames as well. So, and all the third one, so perfect.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Really, it's there is a sort of invisible microphone here. Wow, amazing. No, really, thanks for. So first of all, thanks to Sergei for inviting me, because really I'm enjoying these 2 long, intense days, and thanks to Franz and Mila, because really you organized a very, very interesting and enriching conference in a very nice atmosphere, which I think is the most important. And I think that, most of the things that I can say we already shared here, and I'm happy to share like this moment with people like you. And I think that sometimes you need to invite people who are saying something different, right? Some people protesting, some far-right people say, oh, come on, what are you talking about? The future, the time, the whatever. So it would be even more stimulating. But I think that what I can talk a little bit is also about, kind of adding something to what we already said. I'm a professor at the University of Bologna, I'm a sociologist, but I'm very happy to discover that being geographers or philosophers is not so much different, or being in cultural studies, whatever. But since kind of 15 years, I'm also president of a small NGO doing international cooperation, activism with solidarity, and I'm director of a festival. So I think that it's in my nature to mix a little bit like the theoretical approach with something that I say, oh, what can I do? So I need to do something. So when we talk about this methodology, the premise that we already shared is that, at least for me, but I think for many of you who are here, is that migration is not a problem, could be a resource, and we can focus on migrants not as problematic, vulnerable victims. They are also victims, but they have skills, they have talent, and so we have to approach in a different way. The definition of migration is political, so I think that we have to be very aware about that. And what about us? When we talk about us, we talk about white, rich, privileged people with a nice, with a powerful passport, and what can we do in order to decolonize or at least share our privilege? This is something that I feel. And as Pierre Bourdieu said before dying, if you want to do a good sociologist, and they do this, he realized this very nice documentary that was like sociology as an art de combat, as a martial art. If you want to be a good sociologist, start with what you feel inside and try to find an answer in a scientific way, with a methodology. So I think it's interesting to start from what we feel, right? So when we talk about migration, we are talking about a shifting scenario for research. Everything we already shared. Externalization of the border, the narratives that dehumanize people, securitization, and all what we have told in these 2 days. And so I think that also in terms of methodology, there is a new sensitivity. And being here with you to share this, I think it's a demonstration of what we are saying. What are the implications in terms of theoretical, methodological, and ethical levels? We already shared the idea of reflexivity and positionality. So the idea is not to talk about migrants, not to extract data in a capitalistic way, but is more to work with people, right? To share postcards, space, emotions, and try to understand in a different way how to do research. Because I really believe in research, and I really believe in our role, but also I think that we have to be aware of how do we design our research. What are the intersectionalities between the different power domains, between the micro and the micro, the individual and the social, and how emotions enter into this? Because it's true, emotions are very important. But I grew up with an idea of sociology like Auguste Comte or Durkheim, where emotions were not there. Where are emotions? We are looking in a quantitative way at society like if we were ants or microbes, and still talking about Don Haraway, I think that even microbes, they have emotions and they are even more important than us, so why not? Then, when we talk about positionality, I think that it's important to be aware about this anti-migrant politics, about the indifference, the compassion fatigue, or like the compassionate humanitarian approach. I teach humanitarian communication, and my students say, "Oh, please, professor, but the world is so sad." And I say, "Yes, it's even worse, but we can find a way, to try to change it." So it's important to me to deborder the narratives, especially through the voices of migrants, of refugees. Talking about vulnerability, I think is important, this idea of responsibility, which means capacity. I'm thinking about Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, capacity to aspire, say, Appadurai, but also, give voice to the people. And for us, I think is important to help to create architecture of listening, because otherwise we cannot listen their voices. So for us is going beyond the traditional schemes and consumption. Talking about care, I was quoting Sarah Farris or Sarah Med, the imageries of care. Taking care of the situation, of the dynamics, of the place, of the power relationship, and going beyond the extraction, the extraction of the data. Trying to use different kind of methodology to open space. I will just very briefly show kind of 4 very small examples that I took from 4 different projects where I'm involved. And so, for example, the first project I want to share with you is called Atlas of Transition. It's a project that we just closed last year. It's 2020, but with the COVID. Then is a Creative Europe. So I'm talking about project with money, like the one that we have with Sergei, Perception. So using public money in order to do something useful. And this was very interesting for me because it was for me the first time that I was in a European project with artists. So Creative Europe is for artists, it's not for sociologists. But we worked as a university with 7 theaters in Europe to do what? To challenge the perception about migrants, refugees, and to create symbolic and physical space of encounter, of conviviality. How we did it? In very different ways. You can see here, I just took the picture of the website. We organized 10 international festivals in Europe with also non-European artists, 63 intercultural workshops that were co-created with refugees, asylum seekers, whatever, an international summer school, a lot of installation, production, performance, whatever. And the methodological challenge was, first of all, working academics and artists. That was not absolutely granted, it was not absolutely easy. I was shocked because it was like, wow, we work with artists. And then there were some meetings where it was like, oh, come on. They were complaining like, it's not that you have the theory and I have the practice. I'm more theoretical than you. I say, okay, but try to find a way to work together. And it was also interesting because then I understood, as I was saying, that sometimes we want to explain, to unveil, while they want to veil. They want to hold everything, right? And so the idea was not just to analyze what they were doing, but to collaborate with them in doing something, in doing a theater, for example, an installation, an exhibit. And then was very important also to understand how to deal through the action research with the conflicts and with the negotiations between us and then with the other. Among the many projects we developed in the last 3 years within this project, I want just to show like 2 little artistic intervention that we developed with Tanya Bruguera. I don't know if you know her. She's a Cuban artist based in New York. She's a famous one. She was also at the Tate Modern or whatever. And so the first one is very interesting to me because she proposed this referendum, and the performance is called referendum. And the referendum is a statement, borders kill, this is London, should we abolish our borders? So I say, okay, let's do this referendum. But before we create like 3 public encounters with 50, 60 people, an open call in the city, where we discuss with them if in Italy it should be the same question or if we should change the question. And then, for example, the assembly decided that yes, border kill, but it's not we abolish our border, but just we abolish border, because our was too much psychological. Anyway, then we did like this big campaign in the city. Then we created, we put this in the center of the city, and 15 places in the city where people can vote with a postcard. In this case, the postcard was yes or not. And at the same time you vote, on the screen was like how many yes, how many no. And then we created in these 15 places moments to discuss with people about borders. What's the meaning of that in terms of juridical law? Nothing, absolutely nothing. But for us was to bring the borders that are at the borders into the center of the political space, the open space, as Balibar say, for example, right? But in this case it was a way to say, it's not just theorizing it as Balibar do, but try to put really into, and to create discussion about that. The second one that we realized within a festival, it was a 10-day festival where we invited many non-European artists, mainly women. It was called Home. With Tanya Bruguera, we realized the School of Integration. What is the School of Integration? Was like a space of 1 hour every day from 7 to 8, where we invited the ethnic community or the foreigners who live in Bologna to use this space to do what they want. It was not us saying, you come from Senegal, you come and play drums. It was not. We work with them before the festival and say, we give you 1 hour and a space with a lot of people. You can do what you want. So it was interesting because they proposed completely different things, unexpected things. Like, for example, the Chinese, they proposed 1 hour of karaoke in Chinese and Italian. Or the Eritreans, they proposed like a class to explain the Italian colonization of Eritrea. The Ukrainians, they proposed like a workshop to paint the eggs. In this case it was interesting because we were just creating a space and create a sort of being prepared to the unexpected. I don't have time, already. This was another project with Coming Space. I'm working on this. It's on shrinking areas in 5 European countries and the role of integration of migrants in order to stimulate sustainable development. Here what we did was the photo voice and the mapping, but we already talked about that, so I don't want to talk about it because you already know what is this. I just think that the mapping is important, as we were saying, because you can ask different information to the people and then try to work together, the pictures and the maps, and then the interview in order to understand something more and in order to give them the opportunity to produce and to, again, talk about something. But it's very similar also to the postcard or whatever, and okay, I skip it, but I want to focus more on the last, I finished my, okay, sorry. So the other one is in another project that I have. This is a DARE, is in international cooperation, is on climate change and migration. We use the climate diaries, which means that we create in Senegal, in Cambodia, in Guatemala, in Kenya, but also in Italy, a group of participants, 15, 30 participants, mainly young people because the target are young people. And we create a WhatsApp group, and every day or every week we were asking them some specific question. Who are you introduce yourself. But you can use yourself, you can introduce yourself through a poem, through a picture, through something. Then what is climate change for you? How is climate change affecting your life? And then pictures. How do you cope with change in the environment? What is mobility for you? How is your mobility affecting your family? And then writing the few sentences. And then it was interesting because, again, it was like a creative methodology in order to get information from them, and so it was them stimulating us. And here you can find also this in the website. And for example, I mean, it's just at the end, it was important to also that also for me it's important to mix the way we take the data, we produce the results of the research, but also to disseminate. And in this case, you can see that in the website, we create a space for the climate diaries, where we visualize their climate diaries. The last one, just because Sergei liked it and I cannot talk about that, is the red carpet. We realized this red carpet like a couple of months ago in Bologna within the project of Perception. Perception is the project that we share, is an horizon. It's interesting because this horizon is the line of security. So there are people talking about migrants, about threats, then other people challenge the threats, saying maybe we can talk about challenges. But then we realized the social media analysis, interview, every kind of analysis, and then we say, okay, how can we create an impact? How can we create awareness material? And so we invited an artist, a Persian, a Syrian artist, Sarah Poor. She was inspired by the interview, which means we selected part of the interview, quotes, and we create with her and with she's within a theatrical company which is called Cantieri Meticci in Bologna. So we together say, what can we do? So these are the interviews, these are the categories, these are the main results. And so she say, okay, I can draw this red carpet, which is, the one that you can see here. It's really carpet. It's 13 meters and 1 meters and 30, like that. And then in the red carpet, there are like 13 squares drawn that are representing the different phase of moments of migration, integration, school, nostalgia, the border, or just the narratives, the perception that you have. Then on the carpet there are some QR code that we could put, and through the QR code with your phone you just access to some very short videos. And the short videos, you can see it on the Perception website, the short videos tell you real stories that we collect through the interview. So in this case, for us, is a way to create an engagement of the public in order them to understand directly from the illustration. But also there is, the key concepts are very interesting here because, the red carpet is the red carpet of glory, of Venice, but in the Persian culture, red carpet is something that has is in relation also with blood, with suffering, with violence. And so for us the idea was like the glory for the migrants arriving in Europe, their perception about Europe, but also what we hide under the carpet, what are the violence and whatever. So it was interesting because in this case it's just a way, not to do a research. We can do a research now seeing how people react in front of the red carpet, because we are moving this red carpet every 15 days in Bologna in a different place, like public spaces. We create just a moment to introduce the red carpet through a seminar with, the mayor or the professor or the artist with a little performance, and then we leave the red carpet then, and people pass and we see the reaction. And it was successful also. Okay, sorry, I took a lot of time. Stop.
Really very fascinating project there, absolutely. When I look up that red carpet thing, I think I've read a bit already, but I must look it up. It's really fascinating stuff. So I'm sure there must be some questions for Pierluigi.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was super interesting and so many great projects. So I hope I can continue this conversation there. I was quite fascinated when you brought up the funding element, and the fund was obviously about creative methodologies and activism in migration studies. And here we have these great projects, and the one funded by Horizon 2020, which obviously, as we kind of heard from you, funnily enough, a big European Union funding that funds anything from kind of creative activist things to, basically research that looks at how we can, build ever more effective, brutal, violent borders. So I wondered sort of for you as a sociologist doing these projects and the examining as a similar thing, not to be a party pooper, but where do you think that there's a sort of, where does this kind of creative research and this kind of activism, where does it start hitting a wall, so to speak? From personal experience, because still as sociologists, as researchers, you need to publish this somehow, you need to get it into journals. Where does sort of, I guess because this is important for all of us who are doing this kind of research, where are all these kind of structural boundaries, and how do we work against them to say we're taking these kind of radical elements here and really make them work without diluting them? Because I can kind of imagine that we have this great material, and then we're like, okay, how do I get a publication out of this? How do I make this all about impact? How do I make, And there's always a feel for me that this is sort of slightly almost diluting the kind of radical potential, but I also don't know if there's a good way around that.
Do you think it could be?
Just to interrupt slightly there, I was going to ask a similar question about how the more traditional academic communities, how they consume, how they accept these sorts of new methodologies.
Look, I think that is an opportunity, not a problem. First of all, because I realized that 10 years ago when I was doing this stuff, they were saying, oh, come on, you are an activist, you have to be, a sociologist. But now that I'm full professor, and I can do this without caring about that, also the university understood the importance. I don't know in your university, but since 3 years in Italy, we are evaluating also the so-called third mission, which is the public engagement. So now the university, the department, not the single professor, are evaluated not only in terms of publication, projects, money, but also in terms of social impact, engagement. And this kind of stuff are considered. So now my department is very proud to show the red carpet, even when you have to show what you did. And then you can write 10 papers on the red carpet, right? Because you can analyze the interview, but you can even analyze how people react to this kind of dissemination. So to me, it's just to find the different strategies in order to demonstrate, in order to optimize, to make more effective. And when I tell this to my students, I say, I became full professor doing this kind of stuff, so you can do, don't worry. You can do the red carpet and writing 5 papers about that, no problem.
I was amused when you were talking early on, because in the conference I was in last week in Denmark, there were artists there with the academics, but certainly we got more benefits than I think we had difficulties, shall we say. But it's quite an interesting sort of coming together, I think. It's really quite happening now, quite a lot, I think. These were landscape architects, academic communities, it's different. Okay, more questions? Yeah.
Can I ask you something about your method of encountering people? Because you sound like you are able to create an open space for people to engage, and then to make the most of it in a critical way. And I find often people try to do this, certainly for the first time, are surprised if their community, be it migrants or whomever they are studying, they give them a space and they do something in the space that is perhaps not deep and meaningful and critical in the way that they had expected.
Yeah.
And then they don't quite know what to do with it. And you were telling us about, the Chinese doing Cotterill, and you were quite enjoying that, right? So how do you think about that? Because Because they, you know, sometimes they say something where you think, wow, I hadn't thought that. But, you know, sometimes not.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, you can say something.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's the same anxiety that sometimes us, we academics, have, like organizing a conference and expecting 100 people in the public, right? And then oh, come on, we are just 10. So I went over, and I'm so happy that we are just 15, but we can discuss and learn and drink a good beer in peace. And, you know, I go home and really I learned. And I learned in these 2 days, and I was really peaceful with you. But I can understand what you say. And for example, I can tell that, I mean, there were moments like that. So, for example, during the festival in Atlas of Transition, we worked a month before to co-create through workshop in order to engage people. Because otherwise, if you just go, I don't know, like in a multi-ethnic center, and you want to create something to engage migrants, then come on. But if you go there before, I mean, doing something with them, knowing the people, establishing relationships, saying we want to do a workshop of dance, of painting, of theaters, and so we engage you. And maybe you need something for the school, you need a permission, you need a family, you need to go in that place, you need like the bus to arrive in the center of the city. And so we decided, for example, to do the performance in the center of the city, but also in this faraway neighborhood, because we want to cross. And then when we went, for example, in front of a reception center, which is a sort of detention center in Bologna, but is a reception center, to work with these refugees was interesting, because we invited these 2 DJ from Milan, they are these artists, and they asked like to the people there, to the people of the neighborhood who are against these reception centers, and the people within the reception center to share a playlist, just a song, give me your song, give me your song, give me your song. And I was like, what about this? I mean, what do you want to do with this? And then we organized, I mean, I was managing, but they were the artists. You know, the idea was their idea. We organized a night in a square in front of the reception center, inviting all the people from the reception center and from the neighborhood to come, because there was an event. And the event was like DJ set. But the DJ set was with, you know, like all the Italian style song and song from Nigeria, from Egypt, from whatever. And I was really impressed to see that, first of all, there were like, you know, all the African here, all the Bengalis here, all the Italians here, like sitting like that. And magically, after, I don't know, after an hour, 1 hour, most of the people were dancing. And I was like, wow. And they were dancing, you know, and something was happening in that space. Then the problem is, yes, but this is ephemeral. It happened just for 1 hour, so what? But I think that if happened for 1 hour, something happened. And you know, like, you create a space for these people to meet, to do something together, to share their life for a moment. And then the problem is that, because we are within the European project, how can you measure the impact of this? Because we have this problem. I deal with this with the creative, because, you know, I work with artists, but the European Union say you need to do like the questionnaire, whatever, to show the impact. I say, okay, let's do the classical questionnaire that you finish the performance, or how did you change your perception about what you think about, you know, this kind of stuff. But it's useless. But I did for the European Union. Then it happened like 2 months ago, so it means like after 3 years, that I was in a workshop for decolonizing museum. And I was there, like it was in a museum of Bologna. I was not involved in this, I was just in the public. But then while I was talking with the lady who organized this workshop, the workshop is for 30 young people engaging, blah, blah, blah. She told me like, oh, you know how I got this idea? When you organized this in the museum with the Eritrean community, and then I realized that we have this perspective, and then that we have to work about that. And she's one of the municipality of Bologna. And I was like, wow, this is the impact. but after 3 years, how can I make account of this impact, right? So sometimes we have to deal also with kind of contradictions or difficulties.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to draw a line there. It's fascinating to hear this development. Right, the third paper is Eleanor Cotterill, just coming down the steps now. And here's the mystery paper, because I haven't got a copy of the abstract or title in my package. So
No one does.
I know it's a mystery, so.
Oh, that one. Okay. Thank you. Oh, that microphone is weird. So hi, for those who don't know me, I did my PhD here in the geography department here. I finished just before Christmas, and I now teach in Cardiff University in the geography department there. So this paper it seems like a very tiny aspect of my thesis. It's a section of a chapter. But my PhD aims to uncover the everyday experiences of stateless individuals in the UK using a more creative, participatory research methodology, scrapbooking. So Jennifer Hindman has long advocated the value of working through the messiness of fieldwork encounters. And so reflecting on my experience of conducting creative ethnographic research with stateless people at a refugee drop-in centre in Cardiff, this paper aims to demonstrate the value of working through the messiness of the scrapbooking encounter, producing alternative narratives with vulnerable populations compared to more traditional qualitative methods. So following feminist scholarship on slow embodied research practice, I will outline how the creative embodied participatory methodology enabled an alternative, non-intrusive, highly flexible, careful research encounter. I will demonstrate how care was practiced in research relationships, exhibited in the creation of the books, and evident in emotional attachment to the books, highlighting potentially transformative afterlives. And so therefore scrapbooking isn't necessarily about telling a story, but about making a new story. But before I delve straight into the creative research methods side and my reflections on scrapbooking, I first want to provide a very, very brief introduction into statelessness. So a stateless person is defined in Article 1 of the 1954 UN Convention on the Status of the Stateless Persons as a person who is not considered a national by any state under operation of its law. So citizenship is often a presumed element of identity. However, a stateless person can be barred from education, employment, healthcare, owning property, marrying legally, registering a birth, and detained for prolonged periods. Consequences often include destitution, homelessness, depression, and exploitation. So according to Hannah Arendt, herself a stateless person, human rights ceased to exist for them because it turned out that the moment human beings lacked their own government and had to fall back upon their minimum rights, no authority was left to protect them, and no institution was willing to guarantee them. So human rights are assumed to be universal and inalienable. But Arendt's analysis demonstrates that such rights are alienable in practice, ascribed to citizens rather than human beings. And therefore, those outside the system are excluded, losing the right to have rights, rendering the stateless extremely vulnerable. So, compared to other similar areas of research, statelessness has been severely neglected. Statelessness has been repeatedly conceptualised as a theoretical and legal conundrum, excluding everyday, mundane, ordinary experiences and the complexities of the status which only become apparent in this domain. So to fill this gap, my thesis aimed to ground and expand understandings of everyday statelessness in direct conversation with stateless people in the UK. And this aim presented two major challenges: how to design and conduct an ethical research project with vulnerable populations, and how to capture the elusive everyday. So to overcome both of these challenges, I developed a creative, participatory research methodology centred on scrapbooking. So as already previously mentioned, creative orientations to research are a means of opening knowledge production to the more than rational. So thinking creatively produces knowledge in new and different ways. The geographical discipline has long embraced creative approaches. And these approaches to research do not only focus on the creative output to communicate findings, but their embodied nature also offers a focus on the process, on what happens in the making. An opportunity to grasp the messy, unfinished, and contingent, bringing to the fore the overlooked and challenging the settled. Participatory creative methods have long been thought to effectively engage and amplify the voices of marginalised communities, complicating conventional expert-centric approaches by resituating exploration alongside rather than on research subjects. It is thought that more creative approaches enable deeper relationships to develop between researchers and vulnerable people. It is also thought that these methods can simplify issues. Being able to symbolically represent their thoughts may assist someone in clarifying and simplifying their intended meaning, and really help participants to speak their mind. So scrapbooks are a highly accessible form of self-expression and deeply social texts. Alongside daily ephemera, participants can also cut and paste repurposed images from dominant print media to tell their own story, forming a collage, or as Good describes these constructions as personal media assemblages. Scraps of meaning, things and experiences remain specific, discontinuous and particular, placed in an impressionist compositions that reveal the everyday. Taymas argues that the apprehension of the everyday and the celebration of its hidden wonders is a refined tradition in scrapbooking, memorialising the brief and easily forgotten. However, Taymas also recognises that as a system of documenting a knowable external world, scrapbooking is clearly flawed. If, however, we accept postmodern, post-empirical views of reality as slippery, complex and inherently exceeding apprehension, what matters about scrapbooks is their impact. The non-linear joining together of disparate fragments creates a new perspective, revealing associations and connections, making unconscious thoughts tangible, and revealing the interior shapes of mental space. Taymas claims that whatever their pages overtly represent, scrapbookers are always also crafting themselves. Layouts announce who you are, what you care about, where you live, and how you fit into society. So scrapbooking offers a straightforward, accessible, creative, participatory methodology. Participants have full control in the selection of the images and texts used to represent their own reality. The process offers participants time to think about what images to select, what they want to uncover, and how they want to display their story to the researcher. I also decided to use scrapbooking as a form of elicitation with stateless individuals for practical reasons. So firstly, working with stateless individuals, I anticipated literary and language barriers to the research. But as scrapbooking offers multiple methods to communicate experiences, I thought this approach would overcome these barriers. However, this assumption was massively misplaced. So on average, the stateless individuals who participated in this project had been living in the UK for 9 years. And this meant they all had a really good knowledge of English and would actually email me reading lists throughout the research process. Secondly, like Sinner and Back, aware of my positionality as a white, young British woman, and aware that participants had likely experienced multiple coercive interviews by British authorities who may have looked and sounded like me, I wanted to create an alternative, non-intrusive, gentle research encounter. So how did this work in practice? So 9 months before data collection began, I volunteered in a refugee and asylum drop-in centre in Cardiff to build trusting relationships. Once data collection formally began, I met participants individually in the same space and familiar community centre during the hours of the drop-in. These meetings were highly flexible, moulded entirely around participants' availability, reducing feelings of intrusion. Participants would meet me in the drop-in space when and for how long they could give to the project. So some weeks our meetings would last several hours, and others only 10 minutes. And these relaxed, flexible individual meetings were successful, creating an alternative, non-intrusive, gentle research encounter. Participants regularly came to the drop-in centre to complete the research over 11 months. And this slow, participatory approach enabled the negotiation of a shared research space between the researcher and participant, facilitating an embodied reciprocal attunement to emotions and sensitivity to small verbal and non-verbal details, consequently producing a different narrative compared to a straightforward interview. So the scrapbooking process serves several functions. Firstly, the scrapbooking activity provided a clear purpose for the researcher and participant to meet regularly to complete their books. Secondly, scrapbooking was an effective elicitation activity, resulting in a rich visual data. And thirdly, and arguably most importantly, the trusting relationship developed between the researcher and participant during this gentle research approach enabled interviews, informal chats, and observations during the primary scrapbooking activity. And therefore, the scrapbooks themselves are not the only research output. Interviews, the informal chats, and observations were facilitated by the scrapbooking activity and recorded throughout the research process, resulting in a thick ethnography of stateless participants. So in their conclusion on their book on geographies of making, craft and creativity, Price and Hawkins state that making is full of care towards materials, things, objects, people, places and environments. In her recent article, Pottinger argues that these complex practices of care that shape and take shape within fieldwork encounters are often admitted. Throughout my fieldwork with stateless persons, I witnessed and participated in careful research encounters. Care was experienced by both researcher and participants in the development of research relationships, practiced by participants in the making of their books, and evident in the emotional attachments developed between the participants and their books. And I'll firstly go through research relationships. So participant apprehension at the beginning of a project using a creative methodology is not unusual. The method can be daunting and present an immediate boundary. Specifically, scrapbooking is a Western creative practice, and all participants in this study originated from the Middle East and Central Asia and were unfamiliar with the process, consequently causing feelings of apprehension. For them, craft and artistic practice is an occupation rather than a hobby or a therapeutic activity. So at the start of the process, I was consistently met with expressions of uncertainty and insecurity, as you can see on the slide. The researcher needs to support, reassure, and encourage confidence in participants, expressing care throughout the research process. A slow approach was fundamental in this process. I worked hard to make sure each formal research encounter informal. I wanted each participant to feel comfortable and the encounter to be an extension of our informal catch-ups over the coffee bar in the drop-in space. Every encounter started with a hot drink and something to eat before settling down in a relatively quiet area of the drop-in. We always had a quick catch-up, which might lead neatly on to the formal research task, or sometimes I had to swerve the conversation and bring it on topic. But these conversations were very relaxed. I did not want to apply any pressure. There was no pressure to reveal personal information, which was made clear at every single research encounter. However, I believe the relaxed nature of our meetings made participants feel comfortable to divulge personal and sometimes difficult experiences. Additionally, to try and overcome feelings of trepidation, I decided to compile my own scrapbook and complete it alongside participants. My scrapbook documents the research process, but also includes my own interpretation of the prompts for the project. I aim to include a range of materials in various layouts to show the numerous possibilities available. Furthermore, by completing my own scrapbook, I wanted to demonstrate that I was not prepared to ask participants to do something which I was not prepared to do myself. Working with instead of on participants and removing the obvious voyeuristic element broke down borders between the researcher and researched. And this embodied approach enabled participants to see firsthand how I approached my book, what worked for me, but also the tasks I found difficult. And this can be seen in the picture on the slide, which is of my book, where my mistakes are clear with an exploding glitter pen and how I documented the wrong workshop and just had to override it. Working alongside participants helped to overcome a priori's risks of dialogue. This embodied approach enabled a mutual understanding of the research, opening a shared space characterised by selective agreement and provisional consensus. During meetings, we would sit together across a table, which would be covered in materials, newspapers and magazines, which had been carefully dissected, glue sticks, coloured pencils and scraps of waste paper. And amongst this seeming chaos, participants and I would slowly and quietly choose materials, cut, arrange, then rearrange and stick on our pages. These acts of making together facilitated topics of conversation, but also enabled natural pauses, reflections, and moments of care and reciprocity. For most participants, over the time, the slow building of our reciprocal, empathetic relationship helped the initial apprehension and discomfort to gradually recede. And through continuous practice, we developed the same essential skills together. And these skills became embedded, embodied, and routine, demonstrating the comfort expressed by participants. And this is seen in the extract from my field notes on this slide. Care was also exhibited in the composition of the books themselves. And as the scrapbooks were very personal creations, a great degree of care was observed during their composition. Participants used a variety of different creative techniques. For example, M collaged and embellished images she had found online. S used a disposable camera to document the present. And P wrote his own on a word processor, which he then printed and fixed to the book. In each individual encounter, during the selection, cutting, sticking, and embellishing process, I witnessed participants really concentrate on each minute action, extremely attentive to every cut, every positioning, and every fixing. Pottinger argues that this slow pace and attentiveness to every detail is typical of taking care. In the pursuit of precision, connecting the personal and the political, care was explicitly shown towards the raw materials and the product and process. This care can be witnessed in the figure I've put together on the slide, but also demonstrating the quotations in field notes. In the careful pursuit of precision, participants' perceived abilities and inabilities highly influenced the individual scrapbooks. So for his book, if he could not find what he was looking for amongst the materials provided, S was very comfortable sketching the contents of his scrapbooks. So by taking, in this image at the top here, by taking the time and effort to draw a cigarette and fix it to his book, S has focused all of our attention onto this very mundane object, transforming its meaning. So for him, the drawing represented the social interactions which occurred when smoking outside a building with a group of people. For him, these interactions are incredibly valuable for his well-being. As previously mentioned, P chose to write the contents of his scrapbook on a word processor, as he was not confident in his handwriting, as can be seen in this interview quote and can be seen in the image. So in the quote, he explains how he wanted the book to be clear for him and others to read. He was not confident that his own handwriting would achieve this primary aim. Finally, participants were really careful concerning the contents and messages documented in their books. The entire scrapbooking process, the brainstorming, the selecting, cutting, placing, altering, fixing materials, and further modifying compositions, provides participants with the time and multiple opportunities to stop and concentrate on the message they want to communicate. As noted in previous work, slowness is not necessarily harmless. But the slow, relaxed nature of the research encounters made participants feel comfortable to verbally divulge very personal and sometimes distressing experiences. However, at the end of the scrapbooking process, I noticed that none of the participants had included these unpleasant experiences in their personal scrapbooks. I followed this observation up with P, who explained that he didn't want to let these unpleasant experiences define him. He would rather learn from them and forget that they'd happened. He did not want to give them permanent power by including them in his book. This conscious forgetting is a survival strategy and a form of resistance to past oppression. P's life has been dominated by state forces outside of his control, and consciously forgetting unpleasant experiences is in his control and therefore empowering. And so all of the books became repositories of happy memories. Then finally, In her study on artists and their sketchbooks, Jenny Solholm, apologise for my pronunciation, argues that artists often develop emotional attachments, including comfort and care, with their collected materials, evidenced through the vast personal sketchbook archives kept by artists. And this project has witnessed the same emotional attachments between participants and their books. At the project's inception, I made the decision that at the end of the research, I would offer the finished scrapbooks back to their creators. Participants had invested significant time, care, and emotional effort in the making of their books, developing strong emotional attachments. And this is exemplified in the following encounter with W, which I put up on the slide. So I bumped into W on the way to the drop-in one day. It wasn't an official meet-up or anything. And in this encounter, and I haven't seen him for a while, and I was getting slightly concerned. And in this encounter, he explains to me how he'd ended up in prison, and he'd spent the last couple of months in prison. How a stateless person can end up in prison is a whole different debate. But yeah. But after this encounter, I was stunned that even after the dramatic turn of events for W, after he had explicitly expressed, "Now I have nothing," he proudly told me that he had kept his book, that this book was so important to him that he had kept it with him. This emotional attachment was not unusual, and all of our participants who completed their books now have their creations. At the end of the research process, I asked participants why they wanted to keep their books, and this is exemplified in P's response here. I think it's the last bit. It gives you a sense of how far you've come, a good sense of what you've achieved and overcome, and hopefully more to come. So consequently, the life of the books and the project are extended beyond the defined temporal boundaries of the research encounter. The books transform from a current record of the present to a personal archive and tool of reflection. Price and Hawkins contend that through transforming materials, one can transform themselves, relationships and geographies. Following Gibson Graham, Price and Hawkins argue that these transformations are not grand alterations, but incremental, daily, perhaps even imperceptible movements in bodies, human and non-human, attitudes and affective dispositions, across numerous sites, spaces and scales. Price and Hawkins state that making is as much about the promise and process of what can become as it is about what the product that's made. So throughout the project, participants express feelings for hope for the future, positive transformation in their everyday lives and wider international policy. Gauntlet argues that this hope for the future through making is generated through instilling a sense of empowerment. Making things shows us that we are powerful creative agents, that people can really do things, and things that other people can see, learn from and enjoy. Making things is about transforming materials into something new, but it's also about transforming one's own sense of self. Before and at points during the project, P was extremely negative about his life in the UK. At one particular meeting, he could not envisage a life in the UK. He was actually training to swim the channel to get out of the UK. However, as can be seen in his quotes, he became very positive about his future, demonstrating that the stories made during the scrapbooking process have a potentially transformational afterlife. Okay, so to conclude, a methodological contribution was not a primary aim of my PhD project, but developed out of an aim to accurately amplify stateless voices and grasp elusive everyday experiences. So this paper is aimed to contribute to the slow scholarship movement, demonstrating how creative research methods can be used to construct an alternative, non-intrusive, gentle research encounter with vulnerable populations over a long period of time. This approach is a stark contrast to the quickening pace demanded by the neoliberal academy for research outputs. This presentation has argued that the slow, flexible, gentle research environment enabled a careful research encounter. Care was practiced by participants in the creation of their books, through the pursuit of precision, working with materials, and the messages chosen to communicate. Care was also experienced by both researcher and participants in the development of gentle research relationships, and evidenced by the emotional attachments developed by participants towards their creations. Thank you very much.
book. It's getting such richness and depth, etc. So, questions? She has a little bit of time. She hasn't quite finished it.
Yeah, but a little bit.
Yeah, no, you. That part of it. Sorry.
So, thank you for your presentation. It was really cool. Of the methodology. And I have two small questions about your careful research encounters. First, when you put like the picture of tea and a cake
Yes.
in the slide, I try to do the same in my future, and I wanted to know if you did like some, like I found that we feel that it's a careful method for like organizing like encounters moment with participants, but I always find like difficult to verify, to check this idea with the participants themselves, like to ask them like is it a careful moment for you? So no, my question was did you succeed to formalize this idea like in
I should have put.
post-analyze of this moment? And
I didn't put it in. Yes.
another small question. When you also in this slide of the careful research encounters, you put some like part like you were talking about your families, each other's, and I wanted to know if you have experienced some moments where you thought about your own, not personality, but your own life, and if you have experienced like some sensitive subject, sensitive because of the specific context of the population, cultural origins. Like I'm asking that because also in my future, by for example, the religion subject is quite difficult to like be 100% true with like transparent with the participant.
Yeah. Very interesting you picked up the refreshments, because that was an issue. So in the drop-in where we used to work, you know the big Costco cakes? I don't know if people see them, but they're massive like slabs of cake, and we used to get them when they used to go off, or they used to donate them. But they have like an inch thick of frosting around the top. And it's really sweet and sickly and horrible. And so you just watch people just scrape it off in the drop-in. And so I thought, to get around this, I'll just get a lemon drizzle cake because there's no frosting on it. But no, people still scrape the sugar off the top of the refreshments. About whether it was a careful encounter for them, I should have put in... I did have feedback from participants, and I should have put more into this presentation, about... There was a lot of stuff about how creative methodologies can be therapeutic beforehand. And when I asked this question, was this therapeutic for you? The answer was, well, not really. Like some aspects of it, like this was enjoyable, otherwise I wouldn't have come back so regularly over 11 months. And wouldn't regard you as a friend, and I wouldn't do it. But there were some difficult moments in this, and this wasn't necessarily completely therapeutic. Talking about my own life and about sensitive subjects. So I have a bit of an ideology, but why should we as researchers expect participants to give sensitive moments of their lives if you're not prepared to give anything back, if you're not prepared to share anything? So not sensitive, not massively sensitive, but things like I would talk about my family and that I had a brother and a sister, and people knew that I had another half. But then also, this is a topic of a completely different presentation that I gave earlier last year. Being a young white woman in a predominantly male space, I would notice that guys would look at my left hand before they looked at my face. And then they would register that there isn't a ring on my finger, and that I am unmarried, and that either it's a cultural taboo that people won't talk to me. Single men, in some cultures, it's not appropriate for single men to talk to unmarried women. In other, it was interpreted as I am romantically available, which some of the other female refugee volunteers got incredibly annoyed at this. And they were outbursts, like, no, she has a partner, leave her alone. So there were some things that were difficult to manage. I mean, I kept boundaries, so nobody had my telephone number, no one had any of my social media, it was all done through email, it was all that kind of, and there was a distance. And I always I tried to dress appropriately. I don't know if blokes in the room, when they go and do research, you have to think about what you wear, about how it covers shoulders and knees, and you're not wearing anything low cut, you're not wearing obvious makeup, and people trying to take you seriously. So there were moments like that, and difficult moments like that as well.
And it doesn't raise the vulnerability for your research position, those moments?
Those moments. So I'll briefly come in a different moment from my research. So for a couple of weeks, I noticed that nobody would talk to me in the drop-in. And I wondered why, and so I asked one of my friends, who was another refugee volunteer in the drop-in, why aren't people talking to me? And it came out that a rumour had gone round that I was a spy from the Home Office. And so no one was talking to me. And at that point, I got very upset and thought, this was right in the middle of my data collection, so this is the end. This is it, done, got to move on. But I was really supported by the drop-in and the charity that I was working for, and we overcame that. And I think those moments and these moments have all become a part of the research themselves. I think as a PhD researcher, you are your research project, and you can't really escape some aspects of who you are and how you interact with people. So yes, it's not a barrier, it's not a border, it's not something that's gone wrong, it's just something that's become a part of the research project.
Okay, just one more question, Tanya. How about you?
Thank you, Eleanor, it was fantastic. Thank you so much. It's so nice to see how it's developed. It was a question for the whole panel, actually, because this has been a great panel. I keep finding myself trying to think through why we're doing creative methods and why did this a huge trend for creative methods in human geography. We have to accept that it's not a kind of minor position. There's loads of it in human geography. I don't think that's the case in other disciplines. And in listening to all presentations, I felt and I put myself as doing creative methods as well, so it's a question for myself as well. What is this work responding to? What isn't good enough if we don't do these creative methods? Or what are the problems with a different way of doing research? And I feel we have to go there more, not just work through, and I feel this in my own work, I go through all the benefits of doing this, but I feel what's missing, or the ghost in the room, say, is all the things that are really problematic with another way of doing knowledge. So we go back to Donna Haraway's early work on situated knowledge of the impossibility of a God's eye view and so on. And if we don't do that, I think there's a risk of potentially the creative methods becoming another science. So is there a risk of positioning it as, we get a better view here, we get a clearer view from here, or we get a more intimate view through these methods, but we know that all those things are impossible. That's where creative methods start from, the fact that it's impossible to get a non-intrusive encounter, and it's impossible to get a non-violent encounter, perhaps, or completely non-hierarchical encounter. That's the problem, and that's something that's like lurking around, I feel, and that we have to take on, but we can take it on as well and say, that's okay, this is still a better way of doing it than whatever is the alternative. I was also thinking about Durkheim, because you brought up Durkheim, and I feel the emotion is everywhere in Durkheim, actually, when it describes communities coming together, the affective contagion and so on. But then he gets rid of all of it to come up with a scientific account of why he did this. So that's what we shouldn't do. We shouldn't then, at the end, we'll get rid of all the mess and stuff that didn't work and the emotions. This is why this is a good approach. That hasn't come out yet, but I can see, I'm wondering about the move in the discipline of human geography, the risk in human geography. Have we becoming the new science? How we could
Probably we have to leave it here.
Sorry.
For that.
Please let them respond, because then I'll be
Well, then respond quickly.
going on too long.
Not all the rest of them.
No, I mean, for this, again, situated knowledge, for this particular project, I think, the scrapbooking process, as I said, I didn't go out for a methodological contribution at the start. It was born more out of overcoming those two challenges. How can I amplify stateless voices, and how can I capture their everyday? And that's how I came around to scrapbooking. And I'm not saying scrapbooking was perfect. There was a very long, convoluted process. I tried to do workshops, for example, for weeks, and nobody turned up. And before I moved on to this, it was a very long, convoluted process. But how can we... I've also come round to this specifically for this project because statelessness in the UK is very much tied into the refugee asylum seeker population. And very often these populations, by the time they get to the UK, have been in different reception centres, different camps, and they've encountered researchers along the way. And a lot of people would tell me, it's like, well, I've participated in this project, this project, this project, this project, and I haven't heard anything from them since. And I just think this approach for me, for this project, was a way of trying, I am giving back, I have given back to try to overcome that. But I think as researchers, we need to be really conscious of not taking too much or expecting too much. And I came to creative research methods to fulfill all of those practical things. And I'm not saying it would be appropriate for every single research project. And I think maybe with creative research methods, it has to be tailored to each project. Maybe that's the way we get around it before it becomes too prescriptive.
Right, a fab session. Thank you very much.